Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm Fazila Rapani. I'm Head of Clinical here at DD, and I'm delighted to be introducing tonight's expert speaker. So we all know that ACH, fallow times, air filtration, these are all hot topics and the buzzwords right now that us clinicians constantly keep using, constantly keep hearing about. It's a far cry from what we're previously used to discussing, like the acronyms such as MOD and DO. ACH seems to be all the rage. But we all know it's a really important concept, an important topic for us to understand and get our heads around. And we also understand the significant impact that it can have on our flow of patients as we fight our way through this pandemic. So in tonight's webinar, we'll be exploring this concept of ACH and air filtration and how this can help. And we'll get a more detailed and better understanding of what ACH actually means in reality. And we will also be looking at how Aeramax professional units can provide an effective solution to enable us to reduce our fallow times and what the science and the testing behind this is. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mike Booth. He's the Global Market Director for Air Treatment for Fellow's brands. Mike is a subject matter expert and a product expert when it comes to understanding the science behind clean air. So we're delighted that he can join us tonight to share his knowledge. So he will be giving us a presentation, and following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So please feel free to type your answers to me during the webinar and also afterwards during the Q&A session. And I will be putting these questions to Mike. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mike Booth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fazila. And hi to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I appreciate your time. I respect that it's highly valuable, and hopefully over the course of the next 55 minutes, everyone on the webinar today can really get some value from the content that we're going to share. So with that being said, we're going to dive right in. There's a few things that we want to get through. There's quite a bit of content that we've put together, so we are going to move through this at speed. We are recording tonight's webinar, so things will be available afterwards. And of course, we're on hand on the back of today to take any questions and to help further as much as we can do. So in terms of what we're going to try to get through today, really there's four main zones, and it's all around understanding how a commercial air treatment solution using HEPA filtration can really help reduce airborne contamination, but can specifically help increase our ACH levels in relation to the fallow period changes that were announced last week. So ultimately, we're going to take a quick look and a quick recap of how COVID-19 has really put a magnifying glass over the need for improved indoor air quality, really dive into the topic of air changes per hour, ACH, the requirements, and also understanding that not all air changes are equal. And that's a topic that we are going to dive into in a bit more detail. Then we're going to look specifically at the credentials of HEPA filtration. And then finally, finish off by just looking at what makes Aeramax Professional a credible solution for the challenge that many of us are facing today. Just before we dive into the detail, a quick introduction to Fellows. So Fellows, some of you may have come across the organization before. We're a 103-year-old family business. Head office is in Chicago in the United States. Fourth generation run family business. And we've been in the category of air purification for almost a decade now. What you see on the screen now, we have really two main zones to the category. On the left-hand side, we have our consumer solutions, really geared towards personal use, more in the home environment. And then we have our commercial solutions on the right-hand side, which is really for shared facility use across a number of different verticals. And obviously, the situation today has really amplified the need for this product solution. We're seeing significant demand increases across many different environments. But I did want to share a couple of comments about our experience within the dental sector. This is relatively new to us within the UK, but we have been working with dental distribution partners in other parts of the world. We're particularly strong in the French market, the Italian market, We've been operating in Poland in the dental sector and also in the United States. And up to date, we have thousands of our systems installed in dental environments, both practices and laboratories. And we're literally helping protect thousands of dental professionals within these environments as well. So hopefully that just kind of sets the scene a little bit in terms of our experience within this space. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the topic of the airborne threat. I'm sure all of us are very familiar with the commentary that's been published on this topic and really have a good understanding of why we believe COVID-19 to be an airborne threat. But I just wanted to give a quick recap really, just to make sure we have a consistent baseline of knowledge before we go any further. So really there are three main zones of sources that we look towards when it comes to referring to the airborne threat of COVID-19. First of all, the health authorities, whether that's the WHO or the various centers for disease control and prevention on a global scale and also on a European specific level. Then there's a number of organizations that have worked hard to put some really strong re-entry guidance into motion, whether that's on a HVAC level or an air level with organizations like ASHRAE or REVA. In the UK specifically, we have SIBSI, which is all around the built environment, or more specifically, organizations like the OCDO from a dental profession perspective as well. And then finally, there's just a vast amount of data and research that's out there that's been published on this subject as it relates to the impact of COVID-19 and the relevancy, as it's been referred to, as an airborne issue. Most recently on the data and research side of things, many of you may have seen the open letter that was written to the WHO and amongst other World Health Organizations from a group of 239 scientists all around addressing the topic of the airborne threat of COVID-19. So some of this data and research is woven into the content that we're going to share, but in the interest of everyone's time and the respect of everyone's time, we didn't want to spend too much time recapping and reinforcing the proof around the airborne issue. I think that's something we're all relatively comfortable with already. So some assumptions that we're making before we dive into the content. Really, we're assuming that everyone on today's webinar is supportive of the fact that there quite simply is enough evidence out there already today to support the idea of aerosol and airborne transmission of COVID-19 to the point where preventative measures should be seriously considered. Risks have been highlighted within this profession specifically as it relates to AGPs within a dental practice environment. I think we're all accepting the fact that there is a potential risk of transmission and exposure within a dental practice beyond just AGPs. Obviously, this is a key component of it, and it's directly linked to the fallow periods and the fallow period guidance that's been published. But this is something that's impacting many facility types, not just environments where aerosols have been generated through medical procedures. And I think we're all of a good understanding of the previous fallow period guidelines, which were 60 minutes, and how that was largely based on airborne reductions or aerosol risks as part of the recommendations that they were making. So that's really the foundational knowledge that we're looking for before we go any further in today's content. But in the most recent information that was published literally just last week on the 28th of August, and one statement that we've pulled from the OCDO letter is that dentists and dental care professionals need to undertake contact, droplet, and aerosol precautions. So they're very clearly positioning the airborne risk as part of the broader approach to making these facilities as safe as possible as we look to increase the level of patient interactions. And one thing that we really like to underline as part of these types of presentations is that whilst the world today is very focused on the topic of airborne viruses, especially COVID-19 specifically, for us, this issue of airborne risks and indoor air quality absolutely doesn't stop at viruses. It's been very well published by associations such as the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that our indoor air quality is typically much worse than our outdoor air quality. This is ultimately because of the way that we build our buildings, the way that we've obsessed over green and energy efficiency, and ultimately we depend on mechanical processes in order to help our buildings breathe for us today. And that's ultimately what's led to the topics such as sick building syndrome and many other factors that can make our indoor environments quite unpleasant and potentially damaging to our health. Things like bacteria and viruses are obviously a focus of today, but also allergy and asthma concerns, pollution from outdoors making its way in, VOCs, simple chemicals that are gases when at room temperature, and then really basically odors, which can just make time indoors quite unpleasant. We spend so much of our time indoors. It's estimated around 90% of our time indoors, and quite often spending our time indoors sharing that air with many other people as well. So for us, this is something that we've believed in for a significant period of time. COVID-19 has just really made the world stop and listen to the topic of indoor air quality. And some of the benefits that can be realized by investing in your indoor air quality, they span far beyond just airborne virus transmission reduction, but things like improved productivity, reducing absenteeism, improving the perception of a practice. There's clearly a positive message to deliver to the workforce, but also to your patient base, reducing complaints, and in general, making it very clear that you're prioritizing employee health and patient health within the practice as well. So with all that being said, we want to get to some specific information and some valuable guidance that people can really take away with them on the back of today's webinar. So the first thing that we want to dive into a little bit more detail on is the published guidance in terms of fallow time reductions. So the first thing is really looking at the standard operating procedure document that was titled Transition to Recovery, that was updated. Version 3 was released just last week on the 28th of August, and some really clear guidelines that have been updated as part of this overall document. So the first thing, just as a quick high-level summary, this document and this guidance remains very closely linked to the PHE guidance in recognition of the ongoing risks within our communities and within our population today within the United Kingdom. It continues to recognize droplet transmission, but also continues to reinforce the risks related to airborne transmission as well. So part of that, fall into the ground or fall into surfaces relatively quickly, but the airborne precaution is really where we start to look beyond the 1 to 2 meter social distancing principle. In terms of some specific definitions, I'm sure this is really familiar territory to everyone on the webinar tonight, but it really defines an aerosol generating procedure, an AGP, as any medical and patient care procedure that results in the production of airborne particles, or more specifically, aerosols. And within the dental environment or dental practice environment, they're really described as anything that's using high-speed handpieces, ultrasonic or other mechanized scalers, and any sort of high-pressure systems as well, such as 3-to-1 air syringe. So just some guidelines as that foundational knowledge. No major updates as part of what we're looking at right here in relation to the August version, but really just a continuation and a reinforcement of that guidance that was published originally in version 1 and version 2. Now, where the new news really was included within this latest version, within version 3, was in relation to the fallow period guidelines. So previously, within a typical dental practice environment, a dental surgery environment where AGPs are taking place, the guidelines geared towards neutral air pressure environments, which many dental practices within the UK are going to be using a neutral air pressure environment. The guidelines were all geared towards a 60-minute fallow period from the end of a procedure up until it was safe for the environment to be cleaned, ready for the next patient to enter that room. So what has been continued as part of that guidelines is the focus was on the 1 hour period, was trying to get to a level of 99% reduction of the droplets and the aerosol issues being removed from the environment. So ultimately the goal was, and the belief was, that after a 60-minute fallow period, 99% or more of the risk that's potentially in the air will no longer be a risk, will no longer be something that people are exposed to if they were to enter that room after a 60-minute fallow period. So ultimately, the guidelines were very clear in the fact that there are many factors that influence the rate at which these issues can be dealt with. So first of all, it's obviously the actual procedure itself, and there's no exact science to what level of contamination can be produced, but also the way in which the building systems are designed, spec'd, the way that they're performing, if they continue to perform in a fit for purpose way, and also highly dependent on how those systems are being maintained as well. So obviously there's a high dependency on either mechanical processes, mechanical ventilation systems, or in some cases, natural ventilation approaches as well. And the topic of natural ventilation, I know, is of interest to many people within the dental community. That's something that we are going to spend a little bit of time going into a little bit more detail on tonight's webinar as well, just understanding how reliable is it to look towards natural ventilation, and how consistently can that approach really deliver what's needed within these environments today. So ultimately, the goal within a dental practice is to set these systems to just provide the maximum amount of fresh air possible. There was a big shift once COVID first started to affect the UK. There was a big shift away from recirculation, even if it's recirculation within the same environment, and a lot of guidelines coming from organizations like SIBC for the HVAC space, or ASHRAE on a global level, or REVA from a European standpoint, very much towards using as much outdoor air as possible. Now, I've taken this from the document, so I've used the term fresh air. Personally, I don't like the term fresh air because it's a huge assumption that the outdoor air being introduced into the environment is of a good air quality level as well, which is certainly of no guarantee, especially if we're operating these environments in busy city spaces as well. So ultimately, these new guidelines, they really broke an approach into two kind of lines of strategy, really. First of all, to be consistent with the previous guidance, in a single room where 6 air changes per hour, and we will go into a little bit more detail on what we mean by an air change per hour, where 6 air changes per hour can be delivered, or a single air change every 10 minutes. A 60-minute fallow period or 60-minute downtime is recommended. So that's completely consistent with the guidelines that were previously published. Now, where the change has come is if an environment is able to prove the delivery of 10 to 12 ACH or 10 to 12 air changes per hour, then they're now recommending a 20-minute AGP downtime period. So a fallow period reduction of 40 minutes, from 60 down to 20 minutes, which I'm sure is highly appealing to everyone. The amount of additional patients that we can potentially get through that surgery room within a day is significant. That means better patient provision. That means potentially revenue impact as well. And ultimately, we can do that, but also ensure that the environment is safe for our doctors, for our clinicians, for our workforce, and for our patients to spend their time in. Now, within the guidelines, what was made very clear was that it's really the responsibility of the practice to undertake a detailed review of what their ventilation system is able to provide, whether that's a natural approach or a mechanical approach. And what the guidelines actually recommend is that where necessary, you look towards your contractor or the manufacturer of your solution in order to understand exactly what is being delivered within that particular environment. Just to clarify, the fallow time period is calculated from the end of the procedure, not from the end of the patient interaction, but from the end of the actual procedure. And finally, on this slide, there's a big responsibility that ultimately sits with the practice. So whilst the practice can look to the manufacturer or look to the contractor, ultimately the reliability and the performance of what's being provided for the patient health and for the workforce health, that responsibility sits at the practice level or at the organization level, depending on the overall structure. So that's really what we want to walk through in terms of these updates to the fallow period guidelines and this new news from the OCDO. What we'd like to look at now is really just a bit of an overview in terms of what the various approaches could look like as we look towards the topic of air hygiene. So the first thing that we like to look at when we talk about this type of content is really a well-established model, which is the hierarchy of controls. And this is something that can be applied to many, many different types of hazard avoidance or risk management. And basically, it goes from the most effective approach at the top of the triangle down to what's seen as the least effective approach down towards the bottom of the triangle. So in this instance, elimination down to PPE. Now, if we try and put some examples to these various terms, we can start to make this a bit more COVID relevant within a dental environment. So first of all, elimination would be the safest approach, but arguably the least sustainable approach as we look to reoccupy and get back to normal, and that would be a complete lockdown. Substitution, there really is no option here. This would be something like the use of asbestos within the built environment. That would be an example of substitution in relation to the hierarchy of controls methodology. Engineering controls is really in the realm of COVID, is things like ventilation, filtration, physical barriers. Administrative controls would be things like signage, hand hygiene protocols. Within a dental environment, quite simply introducing contactless payment or remote payment, where a patient can maybe complete a transaction when out of the actual building. And then finally, PPE, as we're all familiar with, masks, gloves, those types of activities. Now, an air hygiene solution sits right at the heart of this methodology as an engineering control. So nicely balanced in terms of the ongoing sustainability of this type of approach, but also the credibility of the approach as well in terms of its overall effectiveness. Now, within the guidelines that have been published from organizations such as ASHRAE or SIBSE, which is the Chartered Institute for Building Service Engineers within the UK, there's really 4 main zones of how you can approach an issue like this when considering your HVAC system. For the purpose of this content, I am oversimplifying and I am paraphrasing in some instances, but this is just to give a high-level overview of the 4 different approaches. So first of all, you can look to your actual system filtration. The introduction of filters can ultimately increase the filtration efficiency and also decrease the amount of particulate that can be introduced into the space. Ultimately, the recommendation here, as you look to that guidelines, is to improve the overall filtration efficiency. But as with any of these approaches, there are limitations. And at the end of the day, if you increase the filtration within a system, you're also increasing the level of resistance. So you need more air, more energy, more power in order to move that air through. Also, quite simply, within many dental environments, these types of systems just don't exist. So this type of approach is just really a non-starter. Secondly, dilution, and this is ultimately increasing the amount of air that's being provided. Again, that term fresh air, but ultimately this is outdoor air that we're talking about. As much as possible, avoiding recirculation. But again, from a sustainability perspective, this is a significant increase to the running costs, and there can be limitations depending on the system design, just in terms of how much percentage of outdoor air you're able to introduce based on your own system setup. Disinfection is the use of some form of sterilization technology introduced within the system. The most commonly accepted ones are things like UVC or UVGI. You might be familiar with both of those terms. Really, the issue here is that depending on how these systems are introduced or how these technologies are introduced, they can actually spend more time cleaning the inside of the system than they can actually benefit in the air. It is quite an exact science in order to get a UV solution right. You need the right amount of energy or power. It needs the right contact or dwell time with whatever it is that it's trying to clean. And it needs that right level of exposure and an overall balance of all those factors in order to be as effective as possible. Just simply introducing a UV light into an existing airflow system is not the right solution. And we see that both with air purification units, but also with in-system approaches as well. And there are also some health risks. You don't want to be exposed to this type of light, to the eyes, to the skin, and that's something to be cautious of as well. And then finally, pressurization. So this is the use of either negative or positive pressure within a dental environment. The guidelines will be more towards negative pressure, which would really encourage the issue to leave the room, ideally out through a window or out through a system. That could also be extraction as well, extracting from the room into the outdoor environment, and really trying to control it in that way. Again, these are quite complex things to introduce. There can be cost limitations to these types of approaches, but we just want to give some indication of what these hygiene strategies as it relates to HVAC could look like. And as promised, linked to the topic of HVAC is natural ventilation. So as it relates to infection control, ultimately, we just wanted to share a few comments on this topic. There are really some limitations as we look towards natural ventilation. It's highly inconsistent. Ultimately, if we're trying to deliver 10 to 12 air changes per hour, it's not very reliable or consistent to look towards a natural ventilation solution. The other thing that we were able to show with some simulations that I will come on to in a short while is that if you're not careful about how you approach the topic of natural ventilation, you can end up removing the problem from the room, but actually moving it to other parts of the building. So if you imagine an open window and an open door within a facility, the airflow movement is typically going to be air into the room and then that air into other parts of the facility, which is certainly not what you want, especially if you've got staff or patients spending time in other parts of the facility as well. So as it relates to these HVAC approaches, organizations like ASHRAE and the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they've all come out and said that to consider the use of a HEPA, standalone HEPA or a localized HEPA filtration system with just the focus on making sure that it delivers the right amount of air and is moving the air ultimately through a high grade of filter, of which a HEPA filter is. So I did want to explain a little bit about the science of how HEPA filtration actually works. So the first myth that we'd like to bust is that HEPA filters, they absolutely do not stop working at the particle size of 0.3 microns. There's a reason why HEPA filtration certifications are focused on 0.3 microns, and that's quite simply because 0.3 microns scientifically is a difficult particle size to capture. So this graph is not to scale, it's somewhat over exaggerated, but what it does is it shows that actually what happens is that there's just a dip at the 0.3 micron zone, maybe slightly above, maybe slightly below, of which the percentage of filtration efficiency does drop slightly. But what you see that's shown here on the visual on screen is that it does increase again once it gets to smaller particle sizes. And that's ultimately because a HEPA filter does not work like a sieve or it does not work like a net. The laws of physics mean that HEPA filters or these other types of filters like a HEPA filter, they work using different filtration methods, which basically means that when one filtration method stops being effective, there's another physics method that starts being effective or picks up where one left off. So the reality is that HEPA filters do capture all particle sizes. There's an insignificant dip from 100% at the 0.3 micron size. It absolutely doesn't stop working at the 0.3 micron level. And the reason for this is the law is called the Brownian movement or the Brownian law. And this is basically just identifying that because of the size of particle that we're talking about, at the 0.3 micron particle size, things aren't moving in the air in a linear fashion. Things are moving in the air almost like pinballs, rebounding and bouncing off things left, right, and center. And this ultimately leads to the way that filters are able to capture or remove these types of issues from the air. If we zoom right in to look at a HEPA filter, what you can see on the left here is the trap method. So things that are larger in size, around 5 microns or above, still not visible to the human eye, but they're large enough where they're going to be physically trapped by a filter such as a HEPA filter. But if you look on the right hand side, if we zoom in to start to look at the 0.3 micron level, those little white dots all represent particulate matter that's been captured by this filter. Now what you can quite clearly see is that those little white dots could easily fit through the gaps, but they don't, and that's simply because of the way in which a HEPA filter is able to remove those issues from the air. Like I said, because of the different physics methods of how these filters actually work. So on the topic of ACHs, there's a lot of guidance around 6 ACHs meaning a 1 hour period, or 10 to 12 ACHs meaning a 20-minute period. So I just wanted to really touch on the topic of ACHs. So first of all, to understand an ACH, you need to understand the topic of airflow. And airflow is ultimately the volume of air supplied by any given solution or exchanged within a window of time. So typically within the UK, we would refer to airflow using the measurement meters cubed per hour, or in some cases, liters per second, but all ultimately metric measurements. So when we look at ACH, what this actually stands for is air changes per hour. This is the amount of times a solution is delivering a theoretical full air change of the total volume of air within the space per hour. And the reason we say theoretical is that one air change within an hour doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the air within the room has been passed through that system or has been changed by that system. What it means is that the volume of air in that room, if that was 40 cubic meters, that solution is able to provide 40 cubic meters of air within that 1 hour period. But you need multiple air changes per hour in order to get a good overall rotation of all the air, of all the volume within the space. And there's other factors that influence the performance of a solution as well. Ultimately, the combination of ACH and airflow, they're major indicators of the overall power of a system and the performance of an air purifier, or indeed of other air solutions as well. Now, there are solutions out there that rely heavily on really high single air pass performance, and they can be credible. They can be credible at dealing with the issue, but if they're not delivering those high number of air changes per hour, then ultimately the risk is that they're not getting the issue through the system fast enough. Because what we're talking about here is not a one and done environment where you're trying to remove a problem in a single instance, but you're talking about during an AGP, you're talking about constant contamination being introduced. So what is hyper critical is the right number of air changes per hour in order to proactively respond to that situation and get that air quality back to a baseline, a clean standard, as quickly as possible. Ultimately, these high ACH numbers is the only way to ensure that you're continuously and proactively managing the problem within the space, especially if you're trying to achieve those 10 to 12 air changes per hour in order to deliver that reduced fallow period of 20 minutes. So one thing that we'll see when we look at the Aeramax professional solution is the fact that we are a wall-mounted solution, and we've actually done some computational fluid dynamic studies to show the benefits of a wall-mounted solution close to the ceiling. So our typical install height from the ceiling to the top of the solution is between 20 to 25 centimeters. And what we're able to show by our performance data is that by having it installed at this height, you're able to actually improve the overall control of the space. You have a little bit more flexibility of getting closer to different environments. You're not restricted by cabinets or cupboards or things within the room. We respect that space can be limited within a dental surgery room. You get more chance of creating a whole room circulation. You may often see this referred to within the HVAC space as a laminar airflow. Ultimately, the ability to achieve a good throw of air out of the machine and to get as much circulation as possible of all the air within the space. You get a more balanced distribution of the air. You're pulling the issue out of head height as well, rather than pulling the problem from floor height. Ultimately, we're talking about a respiratory issue, and you really get more out of those air changes per hour. And this comes back to the point I mentioned a second ago, that not all air changes per equal. It's the positioning of how that air change is being delivered, but also the quality of the filter that the air change is being delivered through as well. So one simple way to think about this is like lighting. You wouldn't light a room by using the bottom corner of the room. You'd get that light up as high as possible to get the best possible coverage of the space. And you can use that same type of approach when thinking about air quality as well. So one thing that we did in preparation for tonight's webinar was some fallow period simulations, and we tried to do this as quickly as possible in response to those new guidelines that came out on the 28th of August. So for this, what we did was we designed a typical dental surgery layout. For the purpose of this exercise, we looked at a 4x4 meter space with a 2.5 meter ceiling height, so a total cubic volume of 40 cubic meters. And then we looked at three approaches. One was an open window, and we looked at an open window based on a closed door environment, because typically we would expect to see the door being closed within this space. We looked at a HVAC approach, and we also looked at an Aeramax professional approach as well. And we looked at two different airflow levels, one looking at 6 air changes per hour and one looking at 12 air changes per hour. And we measured the air quality levels at two different levels. One was directly at the dental practitioner's head, because that's obviously one zone that we're particularly concerned with. And then the other measurement was an average sensor reading within the space at both standing and sitting height, just to represent both where patients may be within the space, but also where other professionals and practitioners may be spending their time while these procedures are being undertaken. So here you can basically see the overall layout that we looked at. Now, I want to get to the results quite quickly, but just to give you a little bit of an indication as to how we built these simulations. And full transparency, we built these ourselves. These are by no means done by independent laboratories or independent associations. This is our way of looking at it, but we've tried to be as fair as possible. The consistent measurement in all of this is the amount of contamination that's being introduced. So we just picked a level of contamination being released from the patient. Our focus really isn't on the accuracy of that level of contamination. It's in comparing the methods of dealing with the issue and understanding how quickly they were able to respond to that problem. So for the approach of HVAC, we looked at a typical approach in order to generate 6 air changes per hour, which would be 238 cubic meters per hour within this particular layout. And we based our assumptions on the air being 65% clean, which is based on 30% fresh or outdoor air being introduced, and then the rest of it being passed through a filtration process, which will remove 50% of contamination. So all in all, 65% clean air, 35% recirculation within that particular room. Then we looked at 2 scenarios using our Aeramax professional solution, one using our AM3 and one using our AM4. What we mean by those terms will be a little bit clearer in a short while. And then we looked at that natural ventilation approach. And again, you can typically see much higher airflows with natural ventilation, but as soon as you close the door, you reduce the impact of that natural ventilation because it's just coming in through one space and leaving out through the same space. The impact drops by around 85 to 90% if you close the door within the space. If you open the door within the space, then that air change number increases again. But what you're doing is potentially moving that problem out of the practice room, but into other spaces within the overall surgery or within the overall practice, sorry. So, but for the purpose of the window or the natural ventilation approach, we assumed 100% clean air, which is really not an accurate assumption, but for the purpose of COVID contamination, it would be non-COVID air coming into the room. So because of the airflow rates, you can see here the amount of time it takes for a single air change, either 10 minutes or 5 minutes if you're looking at the solutions to the left, or 28 minutes based on the airflow level of the natural ventilation approach. So you see the number of air changes per hour that we're able to get to with these solutions. So looking at the results, and this is where hopefully it gets really interesting for everyone. First of all, the HVAC approach. Basically, with this approach, a single air change was able to deliver a 50% reduction in the contamination exposure. And the overall reduction within the hour was 98% of the problem. So the 6 air changes per hour within a 1 hour fallow period, makes pretty good sense. In order to get to that 99% reduction, so only 1 percentage point above where we're able to get to here, you need more than the 1 hour period. That's what this simulation found at least. So a little bit more airflow would certainly help you get to that using that HVAC approach, but you're still with the 1 hour fallow period with this. The next solution along the AM3 PC, here we look at a 6 air change approach. A single air change here was able to deliver a 63% reduction in contamination, and within the hour we were able to reduce 100% of the issue. In actual fact, we were able to get to above that 99% level of reduction within 37.4 minutes within this simulation. And then the third one is the AM4 unit. This was set to deliver 12 air changes per hour or just under. And just because of that heavy rotation, we were able to get to 70% reduction within a single air change. We're able to get to 100% reduction within 18 minutes, which fits perfectly with the 20-minute fallow guidelines with a 10 to 12 air change per hour solution. So the logic that's being published as part of the guidelines makes sense. And what's pleasing to see is that this solution is able to get there based on our simulation. And then finally, without going into too much detail, the natural ventilation approach just wasn't able to get there. You're looking at more than 2 hours based on the data that we used as part of our simulation build here. So looking at the graphical data, here you can see all 4 methods are layered on top of each other. So first of all, the window. With the window, because of the amount of air changes, you've got the highest increase of of the contamination, and the longest time period for it to get it out of the room. So just to be clear, moving from left to right, the first 10 minutes is the procedure taking place. That's when you see the buildup of the problem. And then the following 60 minutes is the 1 hour period that we've used in order to monitor the performance post-procedure. So it's a 10-minute procedure with a 1 hour monitoring period afterwards. And moving one level down from the yellow bar, you see the HVAC approach. You still see an increase within the problem, and at that time period getting close to that 1 hour in order to get rid of the whole issue. In fitting with the data we just looked at, the AM3 approach, which is set to deliver 6 air changes per hour, still a slight increase, but quite a rapid decline, as you see from the visual. And then the final approach, which is the one that's set to deliver 12 air changes per hour, what's really interesting is that there's no gradual increase. There's no buildup of the issue. The issue is being introduced, of course, because there's a source of contamination within the space, but it's very being closely controlled, very close to the original source contamination level. So it's proactively managing it straight away, which reduces exposure during the procedure, and it very quickly drops off once the procedure ends, based on these simulations right here. So just to visually show this, what we're looking at here side by side is on the left-hand side, that's 12 air change per hour air purification solution, and on the right-hand side, the HVAC approach. So right about now, the procedure is ended. You see very quickly on the left, the issue visually disappearing from the space. Whereas on the right-hand side, even now, we're now 25 minutes into the process, getting close to 30 minutes into the process, still some movement within the space of the overall contamination being reduced. And you see from the visuals on the right-hand side that even though we can't visually see it now on screen, that issue is still ultimately being detected within that space, and is still being reduced even now as we're 50 minutes into that post-procedure time period. So just a visual indication of what we were able to find through these simulations. What we've got here as well, just to back this up a little bit further, is 2 freeze frames. The freeze frame that we're looking at right now, at the top is the freeze frame at the peak of the procedure in the HVAC approach, and then the freeze frame at the peak of the procedure with the 12 air change per hour approach with our AM4. You see a much more concentrated red, which is the bad air, the more concentrated contamination, much more blue and much more non-color specific air within the space in the lower solution. And then 5 minutes post-procedure, you see that the system on the top right, the HVAC system with 6 air changes per hour, trying to manage that as quickly as it can do, but still contamination within the space after 5 minutes. On the bottom right-hand side, it's the 12 air change per hour solution. So you really visually start to see a much cleaner environment. So the conclusions that we got to by looking at these simulations is ultimately that the window and the HVAC approaches, there was a risk of movement into other rooms within the overall practice. The only one that was able to prevent an increase during the procedure was the 12 air change per hour approach. The fallow period of 20 minutes makes perfect sense when going with a 10 to 12 air change per hour solution, and our simulation findings really supports that logic. But there's also consideration to a 6 air change per hour solution. Now, it could be that there's non-AGP rooms where you want this type of solution in place. It could be that post-COVID, when these fallow restrictions are no longer in place, that a 6 air change per hour solution is highly credible within the environment. What you might also consider is trying to get to those 10 to 12 air changes by using 2 solutions, a fixed wall-mounted 6 air change per hour solution, and then a portable 6 air change per hour solution as well. And that could be really complementary to have side by side whilst these restrictions are in place. But then post-COVID, you may want to spread that around in other areas of the practice as well. And one really important point to underline is that the dentist did remain exposed during the procedure. There's really nothing we can do to avoid that with this type of approach. But obviously, this just reinforces the importance of PPE. Masking and visors and other types of extraction are all critically important as part of these procedures as well. So I am conscious of time. So we have spent most of our time talking through the science, understanding the HEPA filtration, understanding the new Fallow guidelines, but I did want to spend some time at least introducing the Aeramax professional solution and really understand what makes this unique as a solution today. I do want to allow some time for questions, so I will move through this quite quickly, but of course we're on hand to answer any questions about the solution on the back of today's webinar as well. So really what makes Aeramax unique, we describe this in 4 main ways. First of all, smart. Our solution uses sensor technology in order to monitor occupancy by sound and movement sensors, and also air quality by using particle and odor sensors. And it means that the machine can respond to what's going on in order to adjust the fan speed based on that particular environment. Now, in the zone of COVID right now and the Fallow guidelines, it could actually make more sense to use our manual settings in order to guarantee those air changes per hour. So if someone was to come to us as a manufacturer of this solution, our guidelines would be to use our specifications in order to work out the size of the room and put the right solution into the space, and use a manual mode, at least during these fallow period restrictions, in order to guarantee that 10 to 12 air changes per hour. But just to know, we do have smart technology in the solution as well. Another benefit of our smart technology is PureView, which I will use a specific slide to give you a little bit more information on that technology as well. Effectiveness is critical for these solutions, and we rely heavily on HEPA filtration in order to get to that 99.97% performance at that 0.3 micron level. We're an integrated solution. We believe in wall mountability, and as we looked at previously, there are some benefits to that in terms of the overall clean air performance. And we pride ourselves on the reliability of our solution. As a 103-year-old company, you don't survive that length of time without being extremely proud and extremely diligent with the quality of your products. And our machines come with a 5-year warranty, just to give that maximum peace of mind up front. So in terms of that smart technology, as I mentioned, we have our EnviroSmart technology, which is ultimately about responding to the situation, monitoring both occupancy and air quality in order to automatically adjust the performance of the machine. It's responsive technology. Over weekends, it can help extend filter life and improve energy efficiency. And it really just means there's very little interaction needed with the product. But one of the key pieces of technology in terms of peace of mind and reinforcing the performance of the product is our PureView technology. So what you can see on the screen now is an actual screen built right into the front of the product. And if we go and take a look at this in a little bit more detail, there are really 2 main pieces of information that you can take from this on-product screen. First of all, we can simply give a rating of the air quality within the room, either clean or cleaning, if the air quality is crept above a certain level of PM 2.5. And we use known standards from EPA, the World Health Organization, and other similar organizations in order to benchmark our air quality standards against. And we're also able to show a real-time read-in of how much of the air in is being removed as part of the air out measurement as well. And we can do this because we include 2 sensors within the solution in order to take those 2 readings of the PM 2.5 levels. We can go one step further as well, and we can actually show a real-time reading of PM 2.5 as the air enters the solution and as the air exits the solution. So you can see at a glance, and your patient can also see at a glance, what you're proactively doing in order to clean the space, and how your procedures are impacting those measurable air quality levels as well. So you can get that maximum peace of mind right there, right on the front of the product. And then the final benefit, which is more of a peripheral benefit to this approach, is we can include on-screen filter reminders for when it is time to change the filters in the unit, which is typically an annual interaction with the product. So this is all about data and visibility for the team at the practice, but also maximum peace of mind for employees and for patients as well, who are spending their time within these environments. So that's the smart technology. In terms of effectiveness, this all ultimately comes down to our filtration approach. And for this, we use a 4-stage filtration method. So we have a pre-filter, which is ultimately there to deal with the larger particles and to protect the other filters in the process. Our second stage is carbon filtration, which is very well known and understood dealing with odors and VOCs, which can be, of course, a concern within dental environments. The real workhorse, especially in today's climate, is our HEPA filter, which guarantees that 99.97 performance at 0.3 micron, but also continues to be effective at smaller particle sizes as well, which is a real common question that we get in light to the COVID-19 situation. And our HEPA filters are also coated with an antimicrobial layer, which ultimately prevents the buildup of mold or bacteria on the filter itself. Now, a virus can't grow, so this isn't about preventing a virus from growing on the filter. Viruses won't grow, they will decay on the filter itself over time, but things like bacteria, mold, fungi, they will be captured by the filter, and the antibacterial, antimicrobial coating will prevent those issues from growing and festering further on the filter itself. And then finally, we include a bipolar ionizer, which is our plasma true technology, which is really there to improve the filtration efficiency of our physical filters as the air continues to be recirculated within the space. Now, one really well-known virus that affects us year in, year out is airborne influenza. This is well understood as an airborne threat because of the way that it behaves, because of the way that it leaves our body as we cough, sneeze, and talk. So we actually went ahead a few years ago and we put our unit in lab conditions and tested it against airborne influenza, and we've got the certification to back up our performance. So we're able to say, and the certificate is on screen now, that Aeramax Professional has been shown to remove 99.99% of airborne virus within 35 minutes of operation. And it was set during this actual application to deliver 5 air changes per hour. So that performance is only going to increase as you increase the number of air changes per hour as well. So just to wrap up, a couple of quick final comments from me, and then I'll hand back over to Fazila to see if there's any questions from our audience tonight. So I did want to just introduce the products themselves. They've been hinted at as we've gone through some of this content today. We have our AM3 solution on the left, and then our AM4 solution on the right, both with that integrated PureView screen that we just looked at a second ago. Our typical guidance is around 5 air changes per hour for a typical shared facility. And in these environments, we can deliver cater for a 30 square meter space with AM3 or a 60 square meter space with the AM4. But in respect to the air change per hour guidelines and the fallow period, the AM3 can deliver 6 air changes per hour if we set it to our manual fan speed 4. So this isn't the highest fan speed. It can go 1 higher as well. But at this fan speed, it's going to be at an acceptable noise level, around 50 decibels in terms of the sound pressure level. And this can deliver 6 air changes per hour within a 16 square meter space or a 40 cubic meter space. And then that would effectively double as we look towards AM4. So 12 air changes per hour within that same space, or 6 air changes per hour within a space that's double the size. And multiple units can be used within an environment, and we also have stand versions available. So we do recommend a wall-mounted approach in order for it to be as integrated as possible, but we do have portable solutions which are sometimes preferred just from a speed perspective to be able to get these things in quickly and get them performing quickly. But in an ideal world, we would look towards a wall-mounted installed approach. Really easy to do, a really low load, very energy efficient as part of the approach as well. So the only thing I want to do here was really wrap up some of the key points that we've gone through. I'm conscious we've gone through a lot, so hopefully there's been some value as we've gone through this content at different stages for our audience tonight. But just in summary, really to recap on these fallow reductions, in order to be able to satisfy the need to get to that 20-minute fallow period, you need reliable and consistent proof of being able to deliver that 10 to 12 air change per hour solution. Also remember that it's not just about AGPs. We've been delivering these solutions to many different facility types pre-COVID, and we will continue to do so post-COVID. So whilst COVID is really magnifying the issue today, please consider a post-COVID world. Please consider a way of future-proofing your practice as part of us getting back to our new normal, whatever it is that looks like in the future. Really, that combination of airflow and air changes per hour and good filtration efficiency are really, really important in order to deliver the best possible air hygiene solution within this space. Don't just obsess over air changes without good filtration levels, and don't just obsess over good filtration levels without high airflow or high number of guaranteed air changes per hour. Not all air changes are equal. This is something that we think is really important to understand as part of this approach. So really consider what each air change per hour is going to deliver by the solution that's being installed. And then specifically from an Aeramax perspective, that manual mode from us is what's going to help you get that precise air delivery. But post fallow period restrictions, do consider the benefits of a smart solution as well. One that doesn't need that daily interaction, doesn't need those adjustments to how the machine is performing. That's something that we really believe in as part of our overall approach to a smart solution. And a big part of that for us is our PureView technology, the ability to not only guarantee the performance of the product, but show the performance of the product in real time, right within the room where people are spending their time. And that's just how confident we are that our solution is going to deliver on its promise. So with that being said, that concludes the content that I wanted to get through, and I really appreciate everyone's time. I know we've gone over slightly on how much presentation content time we wanted to use, but we would like to open it up for any questions that have come from our audience tonight.
Thanks, Mike. That was a brilliant presentation, really informative, some really great points raised, and just explaining the science behind all of it I think is really helpful, because there is a lot of information out there, and sometimes going through all the various bits of information can get quite confusing, and obviously there is some false information as well as true information out there, so it was really helpful, and also really interestingly, the fact that the AM4 manages to prevent an increase during the procedure. I thought that was really fascinating, because some of the other solutions I've seen, it's about the cleaning effect, and you kind of see what happens after, but the fact that you're even during you're seeing this effect is incredible. So brilliant presentation. In terms of questions, please do send your questions on the Q&A box. At the moment, we don't have any open questions, but a couple of people have been messaging me privately, and one of the questions that came up, Mike, is how long do the filters that typically last, and what's the kind of maintenance schedule for them?
Yeah, great question. So typically, the HEPA filter is going to need to be changed after a 12-month period. There's some slight variance here. It's ultimately based on the amount of air that the machine has moved within that time period. So if it's worked on higher fan speeds during that time period, it could be slightly quicker, maybe a 10-11-month time period. Likewise, if it's spending a lot of its time on standby or on lower fan speeds, it's going to be slightly longer. So it will automatically adjust that indication of a filter change based on the actual performance of the solution. But as a good rule of thumb, it's typically an annual interaction.
Great, thank you. That's great to know. And in terms of the manual versus the automatic mode, obviously we're recommending manual for during COVID, so that we can actually control what the ACH is, but does it affect the performance if it's manual versus automatic greatly, or can you just explain a little bit on that? Someone wants a bit more clarification on manual versus automatic.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, we typically do very few installations where manual mode is utilized, just because often people really value the benefit of a system that's going to monitor and respond in real time to the air quality, but also to occupancy as well. So one of the benefits is if a setting is closed for the weekend, the minute someone walks in on a Monday morning, it will recognize that movement, and it doesn't wait for an air quality problem for it to work again. It waits for just some occupancy within the space. So those types of automated benefits are really valued by our customer base. The reason why we focus really on the manual settings today was just for that guaranteed 10 to 12 air changes. And that was really clear as I reviewed the guidelines, that responsibility sits with at the practice level ultimately, or at the organization level, in order to do that. And that's the best way of us giving that guarantee. If we were to put it in automatic mode, there could be instances where post-procedure it is operating at a slightly lower fan speed or even a slightly higher fan speed, but we just wouldn't want to set it to chance. We have the benefit of being able to closely monitor that and closely control that. So I think at least during post AGP, during these fallow period restrictions, the manual mode just makes a lot of sense. But like I said at the end, there's a few different ways to achieve that, and that could be a wall-mounted AM3 and then a portable AM3 that's added in for post procedure periods. And then, you know, once the dust has settled on the situation, then that could be more environments that are satisfied around the environment. There's also other zones as well. I mean, like a waiting room, for example, hasn't got these air change restrictions. In those environments, I would really go with the smart mode performance, the automatic mode performance. It just makes the most sense.
Definitely, great. And I really like the idea of the PureView as well, because I think one of the questions that we are getting asked quite a bit is, you know, how do I know this is working? How do I measure it? How can I show this? Because obviously, you know, if CQC come along or someone else comes along and says, you know, how are you justifying the fact that you have this 20-minute fallow period? A lot of people would like to show that they have carried out a suitable risk assessment and actually have got proof to show that their unit is working in an effective way. So I think that PureView technology, you know, showing you live in real time what's going on and how the air is being cleaned is very useful for that. And you could even keep a daily record or hourly record or something of that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's really down to the practice team on how they would like to use that. But I mean, the idea really came to us because we use handheld laser particle sensors or particle counters in order to monitor an environment pre-installation, post-installation, and it was a few years ago now, and we just said, wouldn't it be great if we could get this type of impact actually built into the unit itself? So that's where the PureView idea came from. And there's a few solutions out there that give an indication of a particle level, but they only measure the air as it's like reflective of what's going on in the room. They're not giving that real-time performance of before and after. And quite honestly, it's a risk because we're exposing ourselves completely to the chance of it not performing. And we're so confident in it doing its job that we're happy to have that displayed on real time right in front of the unit. So I think it goes a long way to give that kind of maximum peace of mind. You know, before PureView, one of the things that we used to recommend was, you know, just look at your filter. Every now and again, just look at your filter and have that reinforcement that if it's in that filter, it's not in your lungs. And looking at that dirty filter is quite rewarding within a working environment, because you know it's doing good. You've done your job, and all the problem is kind of concentrated there. So yeah, I think that PureView just does that in a new way, using great technology and right there on the front of the solution.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. Thank you. There doesn't seem to be any more questions, which I think shows that you delivered a brilliant presentation and actually probably answered a lot of the questions that people had. I think people are messaging me asking about prices, and I think I've messaged some people to let you know prices, and you can also contact our sales team as well to discuss any finance packages as well. And so I think, you know, that's a really good place for us to wrap up. Mike, thank you very much for a great presentation. It was really informative. I really enjoyed the science behind it. And this webinar has been recorded, so we will be providing the link to the recording, because I'm sure many of you would like to re-listen to it or would like to send it to some of your colleagues to listen to the valuable information when you're deciding what unit to hopefully go for. And as Mike said, you know, the DD sales team are on hand, and we also are working very closely with the Aeramax team. So if you have any questions, please do send them in to us. You can email us, you can call us, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. We are also going to be sending a link to an evaluation form within the next 24 hours following the webinar. And if you could fill out this evaluation form and give us some feedback on tonight's webinar, it would be really helpful for us. And we will also put a space on there where if you would like a callback from one of our sales experts to discuss one of these units further, you can put your details and we will call you back and talk to you a little bit further about the units, any information you would like. If you want any of the scientific reports, that's absolutely fine, and cost packages, etc. So, you know, lots of information is available. Please do ask when you call in or email in. We're more than happy to provide that for you. So that's it from us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking your time this evening to listen to us. And we look forward to hosting you again in the future. And thank you, Mike, once again for a great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time, and we'll speak soon.
Good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.